Imagine waking up every single morning to the sound of freezing black water slapping against ancient stone walls. You are locked inside a fortress where the very earth you stand on is completely swallowed by two violent, converging rivers. There are no iron bars to saw through, no underground dirt to tunnel into, just thick, suffocating masonry and a moat that acts as a ruthless executioner for anyone stupid enough to try and swim. You aren't a serial killer, you aren't a mob boss, but you are serving a life sentence without the slightest possibility of parole. Every footstep echoes in the damp corridors, a constant, chilling reminder that you have been buried alive by the state. This isn't a modern federal supermax prison. This is 1621, and you are inside the water dungeon of Loevestein Castle, a place specifically designed to make a man's mind rot long before his body does. If you're listening to this late at night and feeling those chills down your spine, do me a favor, smash that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me which part of this nightmare scenario scared you the most. To truly understand the absolute impossibility of this escape, you have to understand the beast that was holding him captive. Loevestein Castle wasn't just a regular lockup, it was the Alcatraz of the 17th century Netherlands. Situated dead center at the strategic fork where the Maas and Vaal rivers violently smash into each other, this fortress was an architectural nightmare for anyone trying to break out. The water currents around the castle were notoriously vicious. They were deep, freezing cold, and highly unpredictable. If a prisoner somehow miraculously managed to slip past the heavily armed guards, scale down the jagged, moss-covered exterior walls, and hit the water, they wouldn't last 10 minutes. They would either be dragged under by the lethal undertow and drown in the pitch-black depths, or they'd be picked off by the perimeter snipers, who were under strict orders to shoot anything that moved in the water. It was an absolute lockdown, a black hole. Once you went in, you simply vanished from the face of the earth. And the man rotting inside this medieval supermax wasn't your typical hardened convict. His name was Hugo de Groot, known to the world as Hugo Grotius. He was a legal genius, a philosopher, a mastermind scholar whose intellect was so sharp it actually made him incredibly dangerous to the people in power. Hugo didn't rob a bank or murder a rival. He was caught in the deadly crosshairs of a massive, bloody political purge. At the time, the Dutch Republic was tearing itself apart from the inside out. It was a vicious power struggle, a winner-takes-all death match between the brilliant statesman Johan van Oldenbarnevelt and the ruthless military commander Prince Maurice of Orange. Hugo was van Oldenbarnevelt's right-hand man, and in the brutal world of 17th century politics, when your side loses, you don't just get voted out of office, you get exterminated. Prince Maurice orchestrated a brutal crackdown, effectively staging a military coup. The regime's highest authorities moved in fast, sweeping up the opposition in a series of midnight raids. Hugo's mentor, the legendary van Oldenbarnevelt, was dragged out into the public square and beheaded in front of a cheering mob. His blood literally soaked the cobblestones. It was a clear, horrifying message from the state. No one is untouchable. Hugo was next. He spent months locked in a filthy cell, essentially sitting on death row, waiting for the heavy footsteps of the executioner coming down the hall. He knew exactly what a decapitation looked like. He knew the sickening thud of the axe. But by some sheer twist of political maneuvering, Hugo dodged the chopping block.
Instead of a death sentence, the judge handed down something that, in many ways, was a lot worse. life imprisonment. No appeals, no release date. Confiscation of all his property. He was stripped of his humanity and sent down the river to Loevestein Castle to be erased from history. When the heavy wooden doors of Loevestein slammed shut behind him in June of 1619, the psychological warfare began immediately. The guards at Loevestein weren't just doing a job. They were hand-picked by the regime. They despised Hugo. They were deeply hostile, constantly watching his every move, searching his meager belongings, and making sure his existence was as miserable as legally possible. The physical conditions were brutal. The castle was bitterly cold. The dampness from the surrounding rivers seeped through the thick stone walls, chilling him to the bone, causing perpetual sickness and a deep, agonizing joint pain. He was placed in a tight, claustrophobic cell with tiny, barred windows that offered nothing but a cruel glimpse of the water that kept him trapped. The isolation was deafening. Try to put yourself in his shoes for just a second. Imagine the sheer, crushing weight of knowing you have 40, maybe 50 years left to live, and every single day will be spent staring at the same gray, weeping stones. You are a genius, a man whose mind races 1,000,000 miles an hour, trapped inside a tiny box. The authorities wanted him to lose his mind. They wanted him to break, to beg, to slowly unravel until there was nothing left but an empty shell. Hugo was a dead man walking. He had no gang on the outside planning an armed raid. He had no underground tunnels dug beneath his floorboards. Every single avenue of escape was sealed shut. He was locked down tight, buried alive in a tomb surrounded by a moat of death, guarded by men just waiting for an excuse to run him through with a pike. But the regime made one single, fatal miscalculation. They forgot about the sheer, terrifying willpower of a desperate woman. Because while Hugo was rotting away in that water dungeon, the ultimate mastermind of this story was silently watching, waiting, and plotting the most insane, claustrophobic prison break in human history. In the harsh, unforgiving reality of the 17th century penal system, there was a bizarre legal loophole that today sounds almost incomprehensible. When a high-profile political prisoner was sentenced to life in a maximum security fortress, their immediate family wasn't entirely banished. Under strict conditions, wives and children were sometimes permitted to join the condemned man inside the walls. But make no mistake, this was not a courtesy. This was a trap. By walking through those massive oak doors, the family effectively surrendered their own freedom. They became part-time inmates, subject to the same crushing surveillance, the same arbitrary cruelty of the guards, and the same suffocating isolation. This was the brutal reality facing Maria van Rijgersburg, the fiercely intelligent and fiercely devoted wife of Hugo de Groot. When the gavel came down and her husband was shipped off to the water dungeon of Loevestein, Maria didn't stay behind in the comfort of high society. She packed up her life and walked straight into the jaws of the beast to be with him. But if the guards thought Maria was just going to sit quietly in the corner and watch her husband rot into oblivion, they were dead wrong. Maria possessed a deeply analytical mind, the kind of mind that would terrify modern criminal investigators. She didn't weep, she didn't panic, she went completely cold. From the moment she stepped inside that stone fortress, Maria began mapping out the psychological landscape of the prison. She became an apex predator, stalking her prey, studying the guards with terrifying precision. She watched how they walked. She memorized their shift changes. She learned their names, their temperaments, their lazy habits, and their blind spots. She noticed when they were tired, when they were hungover, and exactly what kind of distractions worked on them. She realized very quickly that the security at Loevestein wasn't a solid wall of iron. It was a human system.
And human systems are fundamentally flawed. They get bored. They get complacent. Maria just needed to find the crack in the armor, the one tiny vulnerability she could pry open. It didn't take long for her to spot the loophole. Despite being labeled an enemy of the state, Hugo was still an internationally renowned scholar. To prevent him from completely losing his mind, and perhaps to keep him quiet, the authorities allowed him to continue his writing and research. This meant that he was permitted to receive books. But we aren't talking about a couple of paperbacks slipping through the mail slot. 17th century theological and legal texts were massive, heavy, leather-bound tomes. To transport them, Hugo's friends on the outside, primarily an underground network of loyalists, would pack these giant books into a massive wooden trunk. This chest was a beast. It was nearly 4 feet long, built of thick, heavy wood, reinforced with iron bands and sealed with a heavy lock. Periodically, this massive trunk would be shipped into the fortress full of new reading material, and then shipped back out, filled with the books Hugo had already finished. In the beginning, the guards were completely paranoid. They treated that chest like it was a ticking time bomb. Whenever it arrived or was set to leave, the feds would swarm it. They would pop the heavy locks, throw open the lid, and tear through the contents. They flipped through every single page, shaking the heavy bindings, desperately searching for hidden compartments, smuggled weapons, or secret coded letters written in invisible ink. The security checks were brutal and exhaustive. A mouse couldn't have been smuggled out of that castle. But Maria understood a fundamental truth about human psychology. Paranoia is exhausting. You cannot maintain a state of hypervigilance forever. Eventually, routine breeds apathy. So, she initiated a slow-burn psychological operation. It was a masterclass in conditioning. She weaponized the boredom of the guards. Month after month, the routine played out. The massive chest would arrive. The guards would tear it apart. They found nothing but boring, dusty old books. The chest would leave. The guards would tear it apart again. Still, nothing but boring, dusty old books. Maria was incredibly patient. She let the seasons change. She let the agonizing repetition grind down the guards' suspicions. After roughly a year and a half of this mind-numbing routine, the shift happened exactly as Maria had predicted. The guards, annoyed by the sheer physical labor of unpacking and repacking hundreds of pounds of useless theology texts, started cutting corners. They stopped opening the lid. Instead, a couple of burly guards would just walk into the cell, grab the iron handles, and heave the chest off the floor. If it felt incredibly heavy, they assumed it was full of books. They'd grunt, sign the paperwork, and haul it out the door. The meticulous searches had devolved into a lazy, physical weight check. It was in that exact moment of human laziness that a truly insane, wildly dangerous idea began to crystallize in Maria's mind. She looked at the heavy wooden chest sitting in the corner of the damp cell. She looked at the iron hinges. She looked at her husband. The chest was just under 4 feet long. Hugo was a full-grown, average-sized man. The math didn't make sense. It was a physical impossibility. But in the twisted, high-stakes game of survival, impossible was just a word. Maria realized that this wooden box, this heavy, unremarkable piece of furniture that the guards had completely stopped paying attention to, wasn't just a container for books. It was a coffin. And if Hugo was willing to be buried alive inside of it, she could smuggle him right out the front door, right under the noses of the armed guards who wanted him dead. The master plan was set, but thinking of the idea was the easy part. Actually pulling it off would require a level of physical and psychological torture that most men would never survive. Let's talk about the horrific reality of extreme claustrophobia. We aren't talking about feeling a little cramped in the back seat of a car or getting stuck in a slow elevator. I want you to imagine lying down on a cold stone floor and having a heavy wooden box built tightly around your body. The lid comes down, the lock clicks shut, and instantly, every single sliver of light is extinguished. The darkness is absolute, heavy, and crushing. The air goes stale almost immediately, growing thick and hot with your own panicked breath. You cannot extend your legs. You cannot stretch your arms. The wood presses brutally against your shoulders, your knees, your skull. If you panic, if you scream, if you thrash around in the dark trying to escape, you die. This was the terrifying reality Hugo de Groot had to master. The chest was absurdly small. It measured roughly 47 inches long, maybe 24 inches wide, and barely deep enough to hold a stack of heavy volumes. Hugo was an adult male. To even fit inside the damn thing, he had to contort his body into a tight, agonizing fetal position. He had to draw his knees up tight against his chest, tuck his chin down to his sternum, and press his arms rigidly against his sides. There was zero margin for error. If his elbow jutted out a fraction of an inch, the heavy wooden lid wouldn't close. When Maria pitched the idea, it must have sounded like absolute madness. The plan required Hugo to willingly trap himself inside a makeshift coffin for an agonizing, unknown amount of time, trusting his wife to somehow manipulate the guards into carrying him out. It was a suicide mission, disguised as an escape plan. But when your alternative is dying of old age in a freezing, wet dungeon, you do whatever it takes. They had to train. They had to systematically condition Hugo's mind and body to survive the unthinkable. The rehearsals began in absolute secrecy, deep in the dead of night. When the castle finally went quiet, and the only sound was the distant, rhythmic footsteps of the guards patrolling the stone corridors outside, Maria would quietly open the trunk. She removed the heavy books, stacking them silently on the floor. Hugo would strip down to his undergarments to save every crucial millimeter of space. He would step into the box, lie down on the hard, unyielding wood, and pull his knees to his chest. Maria would hover over him in the dim candlelight, her face tight with anxiety, before slowly lowering the heavy wooden lid. The dull thud of the lid shutting must have sounded like a death knell. Inside the chest, the sensory deprivation was immediate and violent. The smell was the first thing that hit him. A sickening, suffocating odor of damp wood, old leather, dust, and his own sweat. Then came the lack of oxygen. It's important to understand how airtight these trunks were built to protect expensive books from the harsh, wet climate of the rivers. Within minutes, the air inside would turn thick and toxic, heavy with carbon dioxide. Hugo's lungs would burn, screaming for fresh air that wasn't there. Realizing that her husband would asphyxiate long before the chest ever left the castle, Maria took a small, handheld drill, likely smuggled in or scavenged from cell repairs, and performed a terrifyingly delicate operation. She drilled several tiny, microscopic holes into the thick wood directly beneath the iron lock plate. It was a brilliant, desperate move. The lock mechanism visually concealed the holes from the guards, but it allowed just enough of a meager, whistling current of air to trickle inside to keep Hugo from dying. But breathing was only half the battle. The physical pain of being contorted in that box was excruciating. Hugo was a scholar, not a gymnast. Lying frozen in a tight fetal position on hard wood caused his muscles to lock up almost immediately. Violent cramps would seize his calves and his thighs. The pain would flare up his spine like hot lightning. The urge to kick out, to stretch, to just move an inch to relieve the agony was overpowering. But he couldn't. He had to maintain absolute,
dead silence. During these midnight rehearsals, Maria enforced strict, terrifying discipline. She would pace around the locked chest in the dark, acting as the guard. She would listen. If Hugo let out a ragged breath, if he coughed, if he sneezed, if a muscle spasm caused his elbow to thump against the wood, the rehearsal was a failure. In a real-world scenario, a single muffled groan coming from that chest would result in the guards immediately dropping it, popping the lock, and dragging Hugo out by his hair to the gallows. He had to be a ghost. They practiced this horrific routine night after night for weeks. First for 30 minutes, then an hour, then 2 agonizing hours. Hugo trained his mind to disassociate from the blinding pain in his joints. He practiced taking shallow, rhythmic breaths through the tiny holes by the lock, slowing his heart rate down to avoid triggering a massive panic attack in the pitch black. He conditioned his body to endure the cramps, biting his own lip in the dark until it bled, just to keep from making a sound. By March of 1621, Hugo wasn't just a scholar anymore. He was a hardened, conditioned escape artist. He could hold the fetal position for over 2 hours without making a single sound. The rehearsals were complete. They had pushed the human body and mind to the absolute breaking point. Now, all they needed was the perfect storm to put the insane plan into action. And the universe was about to hand them exactly what they needed.
March 22nd, 1621. This was the day that would either go down in history as a stroke of unparalleled genius or end with a bloody execution in the courtyard. The tension inside the cell was thick enough to cut with a knife. Everything had led to this exact moment, but pulling off the escape required more than just preparation. It required perfect timing, psychological manipulation, and a massive stroke of luck. The conditions had to be flawless, and the universe seemingly aligned to create the ultimate cover. A massive, roaring storm was sweeping across the Dutch landscape. The sky was the color of bruised iron, and violent gusts of wind were howling through the jagged stone battlements of Loevestein Castle. The Vaal and Maas rivers were churning violently, throwing freezing spray up against the walls. The weather was miserable, dark and chaotic, the absolute perfect cloak for an escape. But the weather wasn't the only advantage. There was a major distraction happening on the outside. A massive annual fair was taking place in the nearby town of Gorinchem. The streets there would be packed with merchants, drunks, and chaotic crowds. More importantly, the historical record notes a critical shift in the prison's command structure that very morning. The commanding officer of the fortress, the man who was notoriously paranoid and strict, had actually left the castle to attend the fair, leaving his wife and a skeleton crew of subordinate guards in charge. The alpha dog was out of the house. The hierarchy was vulnerable. It was now or never. The scene inside the cell that morning was chilling. There were no emotional breakdowns, no dramatic, tearful goodbyes. It was cold, calculated, and terrifyingly silent. Hugo stripped down to his linen undergarments. Every inch of space inside that wooden coffin was critical. Stepping into the chest must have felt like stepping into an open grave. He lay down on the hard planks, pulling his knees up tight against his chest, tucking his arms in, mimicking the exact contorted shape he had practiced during those agonizing midnight rehearsals. Maria moved with the precision of a surgeon. She couldn't just leave him rattling around loose inside. The guards would feel the shifting weight immediately. She grabbed a few heavy, leather-bound books and some bundles of dirty laundry, wedging them tightly around Hugo's head, shoulders, and hips. She packed him in like fragile cargo. She made sure his face was positioned exactly near the tiny, microscopic air holes she had drilled beneath the lock.
Then came the moment of truth. Maria leaned over, looked at her husband one last time in the dim light, and slowly brought the heavy wooden lid down. Thud. Total darkness. The heavy iron lock clicked shut with a sharp, metallic snap that echoed in the tiny cell. Hugo was officially buried alive. He was totally dependent on the tiny sliver of air whistling through the keyhole, completely at the mercy of his wife's ability to act. Maria immediately pivoted to the next phase of the psychological operation. If the guards walked in and saw Hugo missing, the lockdown would be instantaneous. She needed a decoy. She moved to the bed, stripped off her husband's heavy clothes, and arranged them under the heavy wool blankets to look exactly like a body curled up in pain. She drew the thick bed curtains tightly shut, leaving only a tiny gap. In the dark, damp gloom of a 17th century dungeon, it was a convincing illusion. She then called for the guards. The heavy cell doors swung open, grinding against the stone. Two burly, heavily armed guards stepped into the room. The atmosphere was instantly electric. The tension was suffocating. If these guards decided to follow protocol, if they demanded to see Hugo's face, if they decided to randomly pop the lock on the chest, it was all over. Maria played the role of the stressed, annoyed wife flawlessly. She didn't act nervous. She acted inconvenienced. She pointed to the massive wooden chest sitting heavily on the stone floor and casually informed the guards that she was sending a load of books back to the mainland. She gestured toward the heavily curtained bed and sharply told them to keep their voices down. Her husband was violently ill, she claimed, suffering from a terrible fever, and he finally managed to fall asleep. The guards bought the narrative. They glanced at the bed, saw the shape under the blankets, and grunted. They had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. After all, they had hauled this exact chest full of boring books in and out of this cell a dozen times over the last year. The routine had completely blinded them to the reality of the situation. But as they bent down to grab the thick iron handles on the sides of the chest, the ultimate test was about to begin. The theoretical rehearsals were over. The coffin was about to move, and the terrifying physical reality of what Hugo was attempting was about to hit him with the force of a sledgehammer. The moment the guards gripped the iron handles and hoisted the chest off the stone floor, the entire plan almost unraveled. The weight was completely wrong. Books are heavy, yes, but dead weight shifts differently than human weight. As the two guards strained, their muscles bulging under the massive load, the chest swayed violently. One of the guards cursed loudly, nearly dropping his end. The historical record actually captures the exact terrifying exchange that happened next. The guard, sweating and struggling to balance the massive box, shot a suspicious glare at the chest. He barked, "Is there an Arminian in here?" Arminian. It was the derogatory political slur used by the regime to describe traitors like Hugo de Groot. The guard wasn't making a joke. It was a flash of genuine, dangerous intuition. For a split second, time completely froze inside that damp cell. The air was sucked out of the room. If that guard had just taken 1 second to set the chest down, draw his dagger, and pry the lid open, Hugo's life would have ended right there on the floor. But Maria wasn't the only woman in the room with nerves of steel. Enter Elsia von Houwening. She was the family's maid, barely 20 years old, but she possessed the ice-cold composure of a seasoned operative. Elsia had been fully briefed on the plan, and her job was arguably the most dangerous. She was the escort. She had to stay with the chest, guide it out of the fortress, and ensure it made it to the safe house without blowing the cover. When the guard made his accusation, Elsia didn't flinch. She didn't stutter or look away nervously. With absolute, chilling calm, she fired back with a razor-sharp smirk. There are only Arminian books in there.
It was a brilliant psychological deflection. She leaned into the joke, completely disarming the tension. The guard stared at her for a second, then grunted, shaking his head.
The moment of suspicion passed, swallowed up by the sheer physical exertion required to move the damn thing. They hauled the chest out of the cell, but the nightmare for Hugo was only just beginning. Inside the box, the physical trauma was immediate and brutal. The guards weren't carrying him gently. They were aggressively lugging a heavy, awkward box down a narrow, spiraling stone staircase. Every time they took a step, the chest violently jerked. Hugo was slammed repeatedly against the hard wooden interior. He had no padding, just his linen undergarments and a few scattered books that were now digging painfully into his ribs. His head cracked against the side panels. The blood rushed to his brain as the chest was tilted downward at a steep, sickening angle. The pain was excruciating, but the mental torture was worse. Hugo was in complete darkness, suffocating on the stale air, being violently tossed around like cargo. Every primal instinct in his human brain was screaming at him to thrash, to brace himself, to cry out in pain. But he couldn't make a sound. If he gasped, if a pained groan slipped through his clenched teeth, the guards carrying the chest would feel the vibration and hear the noise. He had to absorb the physical beating in absolute, dead silence. He bit down so hard on his lip that he tasted copper in his mouth, forcing himself to remain entirely rigid as the chest crashed against the stone walls of the stairwell. They finally reached the bottom of the stairs and dragged the chest out into the open courtyard. The freezing wind of the storm howled around them. To get to the river, the guards had to maneuver the heavy box through a gauntlet of heavily armed sentries stationed at the main gates. Elsia walked right beside the chest, her heart hammering against her ribs, watching intensely as the guards negotiated the heavy iron portcullis. Every single soldier they passed was a lethal threat. Any one of them could have ordered the chest opened. Any one of them could have noticed the tiny drilled holes beneath the lock. Elsia had to casually position her body to block their line of sight, keeping up a steady, mundane stream of chatter to keep the guards distracted from the heavy, shifting weight they were carrying. It was a masterclass in misdirection, played out under the threat of immediate execution. They finally reached the edge of the roaring, freezing water. The transport boat that would take them across the river to the town of Gorichem was waiting, violently bobbing up and down in the storm surge. The guards practically threw the chest onto the wooden deck of the boat, eager to be rid of the back-breaking weight. The heavy impact rattled Hugo's bones, but he remained silent, locked in his pitch-black, suffocating coffin. The first impossible hurdle was cleared. They were out of the fortress. But the most dangerous part of the journey, the river of dead silence, was just beginning. The moment the transport boat pushed off the docks, they were at the mercy of the raging rivers. The Vaal and Maas were practically boiling, whipped into a frenzy by the severe storm. The small wooden vessel pitched violently side to side, smashing through freezing gray swells. For the guards and sailors on deck, it was a miserable, chaotic ride. But for Hugo de Groot, trapped inside a tiny wooden coffin in the dark, it was pure, unadulterated hell. Inside the chest, the sensory nightmare escalated rapidly. Hugo was blind, unable to anticipate the boat's violent movements. Every time the vessel crashed into a wave, the chest would forcefully slam against the deck, throwing his bruised body against the hard wood. The lack of oxygen was becoming critical. The air inside the box was thick, hot, and stale. He was breathing in his own exhausted carbon dioxide, fighting off the encroaching edges of unconsciousness. To make matters worse, the violent rocking triggered intense, nauseating seasickness. The urge to vomit was overwhelming. But he knew, with terrifying certainty, that if he threw up, he would either choke to death on his own bile in the dark, or the sound and smell would instantly give him away to the guards sitting just inches above his head. He had to choke it down, swallowing the bile, clenching his jaw so tight his teeth threatened to crack. He was fighting a physiological war against his own body. Up on deck, Elsia van Houwening was fighting a totally different kind of war. Because of the severe rocking of the boat, the heavy chest began sliding across the wet, slippery deck. One of the exhausted guards, looking for a place to rest his legs, walked over and nonchalantly sat down right on top of the chest. Elsia's blood ran cold. The guard's heavy woolen coat draped over the side of the box, completely covering the lock. He had just suffocated the only source of oxygen. He had just sealed off the microscopic air holes Maria had meticulously drilled. If that guard sat there for more than a few minutes, Hugo would suffocate to death in absolute silence. Elsia had to act immediately, but she couldn't show panic. If she reacted with terror, the guards would instantly know something was wrong. So, she played the role of an annoying, overly protective servant. She marched over, yelling over the howling wind, aggressively shooing the heavily armed guard away. She berated him, claiming the chest contained highly fragile, incredibly expensive porcelain and delicate books that belonged to her mistress. She complained that his heavy, wet coat was going to ruin the finish on the wood. She made a scene, acting so obnoxious and persistent that the guard, rolling his eyes and muttering curses, finally stood up and moved to another part of the boat just to get away from her. Elsia quickly brushed the coat away, subtly making sure the tiny holes beneath the lock were clear. Below deck, inside the chest, Hugo took a desperate shallow gasp of fresh, freezing air whistling through the tiny gap. For the next 2 agonizing hours, Elsia stood guard over that box like a hawk. She acted as a human shield, physically bracing herself against the chest to keep it from sliding off the deck and plunging into the freezing black river below. The boat was taking on water, and the spray was freezing on the wood. If the chest went overboard, it would sink like a stone, and Hugo would drown in his dark coffin before anyone could even attempt to fish him out. The psychological toll on both of them during this crossing is almost unimaginable. Hugo was experiencing a prolonged panic attack, completely trapped, slowly asphyxiating, and enduring severe physical pain. Elsia was surrounded by armed men who would brutally execute her on the spot if they discovered what she was doing. Every second felt like an eternity. The storm raged, the guards complained, and the heavy wooden box remained entirely, terrifyingly silent.
Finally, after what felt like a lifetime of torture, the violent rocking began to subside. The boat slowly glided into the harbor of Gorkum. The sound of the howling wind was replaced by the muffled shouts of dock workers and the chaotic noise of the town's annual fair. They had made it across the water. But the most vulnerable, high-exposure moment of the entire operation was staring them right in the face. They had to unload the coffin right in the middle of a crowded, heavily policed town square, without anyone realizing that a living, breathing man was inside. The docks at Gorkum were absolute bedlam. Because of the annual fair, the harbour was packed tightly with merchant ships, frantic dock workers, drunken sailors, and heavily armed city guards patrolling the perimeter. It was the absolute worst possible environment to smuggle a high-profile, wanted fugitive. There were too many eyes, too many variables, and too many chances for someone to notice something suspicious. As soon as the boat tied off, the guards dragged the heavy chest onto the cobblestone dock.
The violent thud of the wood hitting the stone must have rattled Hugo's teeth. He had been locked inside that claustrophobic nightmare for over 2 hours now. His muscles were completely cramped and useless. His oxygen levels were dangerously low, and his mind was likely completely disoriented. Elsia quickly hired a local porter with a rough wooden wheelbarrow to transport the chest to their final destination, the home of Adrien Daats, a wealthy local merchant who was secretly a loyal friend to Hugo. The porter hoisted the massive chest onto the barrow, and the final leg of the journey began. But this wasn't a smooth ride. The streets of Gorkum were paved with uneven, jagged cobblestones. As the porter pushed the wheelbarrow through the crowded market, the unyielding wooden wheels slammed violently against the stones. Every single bump, every rut in the street sent a jarring shockwave straight through the chest. Hugo was being violently bounced around, his head repeatedly cracking against the wooden panels. He was bleeding, bruised, and on the verge of passing out. To make matters infinitely worse, the sheer weight of the chest was causing a scene. The porter, straining and sweating heavily under the load, began complaining loudly to anyone who would listen. He muttered that the box felt like it was filled with lead, or maybe even a dead body. His loud complaints started drawing attention. People in the crowded street began turning their heads, looking at the massive, strangely heavy chest with growing curiosity. Elsia's panic must have been absolute. They were completely exposed in the middle of a crowded street. If a city guard decided to investigate the commotion, the game was over. Elsia, operating on pure adrenaline and cold-blooded survival instinct, immediately went into damage control. She loudly mocked the porter, calling him weak and lazy, dramatically shouting that a strong man wouldn't be crying over a box of heavy theology texts. She tossed him a few extra coins, telling him to shut up and push faster. Her loud, aggressive misdirection worked. The crowd laughed at the struggling porter and lost interest, allowing Elsia to quickly usher the wheelbarrow down a narrow, quiet alleyway. They finally arrived at the back entrance of Adrien Daats's house. The porter dumped the chest in the rear courtyard, took his money, and left. Elsia didn't waste a single second. She practically dragged the heavy chest through the back door and into the dim, quiet interior of the house. She slammed the heavy oak door shut and threw the deadbolt. The chaos of the storm, the screaming guards, the crowded market, it all vanished, replaced by an eerie, dead silence. Daats, the merchant, was standing there, staring at the massive wooden box in sheer disbelief. Elsia dropped to her knees beside the chest. Her hands were shaking violently as she fumbled with the heavy iron key. For a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, she hesitated. It had been nearly 2.5 hours since Maria had closed the lid back in the dungeon. The chest had been violently dropped, flipped, sat upon, and jostled over rough cobblestones. The air inside had to be entirely toxic. The silence emanating from the box was absolute. Not a rustle, not a scrape, not a single breath. Elsia unlocked the heavy iron mechanism. The latch popped with a loud clack. She grabbed the iron handle and threw the heavy wooden lid open. What she saw inside looked like a corpse. Hugo de Groot was folded into a tight, agonizing fetal position, completely motionless. His clothes were entirely soaked through with freezing sweat. His face was pale, his lips bruised and bloody from biting them to keep silent, and his eyes were tightly shut. His muscles had locked up so severely in the cramped space that he looked like rigor mortis had already set in. For a horrifying second, Elsia thought the master plan had succeeded in smuggling him out, only to kill him in the process. But then, slowly, a ragged, desperate gasp of air tore from Hugo's throat. His chest heaved violently as his starved lungs finally pulled in clean, fresh oxygen. He opened his eyes, blinking against the sudden intrusion of light. He was alive. He had survived the impossible. With Deetz's help, they slowly pulled Hugo out of his wooden tomb. He couldn't even stand. His legs buckled underneath him, his joints screaming in agony from the prolonged compression. They had to support his dead weight, dragging him to a chair. He sat there, shivering uncontrollably, a ghost of a man who had literally just returned from the grave. But there was no time to celebrate. They were still deeply inside enemy territory. The authorities at Loevestein Castle could discover the decoy at any moment, and the second they did, the most massive, violent manhunt in the history of the Dutch Republic would come crashing down on their heads. The breakout was a success, but the chase had just begun.
The clock was ticking. Every second Hugo spent in Gorkum was a death sentence waiting to happen. The brutal reality of the 17th century police state was that once a high-value target went missing, the regime would lock down the borders, deploy military patrols to every major road, and execute anyone suspected of harboring the fugitive. They had to get Hugo out of the city, out of the country, and into sympathetic territory before the alarm bells at Loevestein Castle started ringing. Hugo forced his agonizing, cramped muscles to work. Adrian Dots quickly provided him with a disguise. They didn't dress him as a merchant or a nobleman. That would attract too much attention. Instead, Hugo stripped off his sweat-soaked undergarments and pulled on the rough, dirty clothes of a common bricklayer. They rubbed dirt and soot into his face, hiding the pale, refined features of the famous scholar. To complete the illusion, Dots shoved a heavy mason's measuring stick into his hand. He didn't look like an international legal genius. He looked like an exhausted, filthy laborer heading home from a grueling shift. With his heart pounding against his ribs, Hugo walked out the front door of the safe house. He didn't run. Running would immediately draw the attention of the city guards. He had to force himself to adopt the slow, heavy, plodding walk of a tired bricklayer. He walked straight through the crowded streets of Gorkum, right past the heavily armed city militia, blending perfectly into the chaotic background of the annual fair. He was a ghost walking in broad daylight. He made his way to a different section of the docks and boarded a ferry headed south. From there, he embarked on a grueling, incredibly tense journey across the border. He moved through the shadows, utilizing a network of underground contacts, eventually crossing into the Spanish Netherlands, modern-day Belgium, and arriving safely in Antwerp. Finally, he made his way to Paris, where the French king, who despised the Dutch regime, welcomed him with open arms and political asylum. Hugo de Groot had officially vanished from the clutches of his executioners. But while Hugo was escaping to freedom, the real psychological thriller was still playing out back at Loevestein Castle. Maria von Reigersberg had been sitting in that damp, freezing cell for an entire day, completely alone, not knowing if her husband was free or if he was lying dead at the bottom of the Wall River. The mental fortitude required to maintain her composure is staggering. For nearly 24 hours, she kept the illusion alive. When the guards patrolled the corridor, she would talk loudly to the empty bed, asking Hugo how his fever was, acting concerned and attentive.
She kept the heavy curtains drawn tight. She successfully stalled the entire prison administration, buying her husband the precious hours he needed to cross the border. It wasn't until the following morning, when she felt absolutely certain that Hugo was beyond the reach of the Dutch military, that she finally ended the charade. When the morning guards came to check on the prisoner, Maria didn't try to hide it anymore. She didn't cower or beg for mercy. She simply stood up, pulled back the heavy bed curtains, and revealed the pile of clothes bundled under the blankets. The guards stared at the empty bed in absolute stunned silence. The sheer impossibility of the situation broke their minds. The prison was completely locked down. The moat was secure. The walls were unbreached. It was as if the man had simply evaporated into thin air. When the furious, humiliated prison commander demanded to know where the most dangerous political prisoner in the country had gone, Maria simply looked him dead in the eye and delivered one of the most badass lines in the history of prison breaks. She coldly informed him that the bird had flown the cage. The fallout was spectacular.
The regime was completely humiliated on an international stage. The furious authorities briefly arrested Maria and fiercely interrogated her, but they were legally paralyzed. The public, utterly fascinated and highly amused by the sheer audacity of the escape, overwhelmingly supported her. The authorities, realizing that executing a brilliant, devoted wife would turn her into a powerful martyr and cause a massive uprising, eventually released her. She simply packed her bags, walked out of the fortress, and calmly traveled to Paris to reunite with her husband. Elsje van Houwening, the brilliant, iron-nerved maid who had orchestrated the physical smuggling, was also released. She later married Hugo's loyal servant, and they lived the rest of their lives in quiet comfort, funded by a very grateful Hugo de Groot. Hugo himself went on to write some of the most important legal and philosophical texts in human history, laying the foundational framework for modern international law. The United Nations, the Geneva Conventions, the very concept of international human rights, all of it traces its roots back to the mind of a man who was supposed to rot away in a freezing water dungeon. The Loevestein escape remains one of the most flawless, claustrophobic, and psychologically intense prison breaks ever recorded. No tunnels were dug, no guards were murdered, no walls were scaled. A brilliant mind, a fiercely intelligent wife, a teenage maid with nerves of steel, and a 4-foot wooden box completely defeated the most secure fortress in the world. If you made it to the end of this incredible story, do me a favor. Smash that subscribe button, hit the like, and drop a comment down below. Tell me, could you have survived 2.5 hours locked inside that chest in the pitch black? Until next time, keep your doors locked and stay safe out there.